we will introduce Squadron Leader Paul Falconer-West. He was Armament Officer in both Permanent and Air Force Reserve, currently Air Force Liaison Officer for No. 7 Wing, Australian Air Force, and cadets at Pearce, RAAF Pearce.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to present 25 Squadron's World War II history. Number 25 Squadron is the founding unit of RAAF Base Pearce, Western Australia, and has been based here from 10th of March 1938, except between 11 January 45 and 9 July 46, when the squadron was based at Cunderdin, Western Australia, and then disbanded. On 1st of April 1948, the squadron was reformed at Pearce and has remained there ever since. Numbers 14 and 85 squadrons, which also operated from RAAF Pearce, were formed from 25 squadron personnel and equipment. When did it all start? In Victoria in 1937. Number 25 Squadron was formed initially as Number 23 General Purpose Squadron at RAAF Station Laverton, Victoria, on 3rd of May 1937, for the purpose of operating from the then under construction Air Force Station, later to be named Pearce, being built 50 kilometres northeast of Perth, Western Australia. From July 1937, Wing Commander Raymond Brownell, Military Cross, Military Medal, after whom Brownell Avenue on the base has been named, was the squadron's first commanding officer. Travelling between Pearce and Laverton until the squadron was transferred to Pearce the following year was his main role at that time. Members of the squadron's advance party and the RAAF's first permanent presence in Western Australia arrived at Bulls Brook on 11 and 18th of October 1937. That was led by Flying Officer Kelly, who was appointed the barracks officer in 1939. With him were Sergeant Morwood, Corporal Allen, Leading Aircraftsman Ray, Aircraftsman 1 Doak, and Aircraftsman 1 Terry. Squadron records do not mention the advance party, but this information is later given in the station headquarters, recorded against an entry dated 15 October 1942. Intensive training for the newly posted pilots was under the guidance of Flight Lieut.Wallace Kyle, who was an RAAF exchange officer at the time. 6 Hawker Demons and 6 Avro Ansons had to be eventually ferried to Pearce, and it was only accomplished by the leadership, planning and training that Flight Lieutenant Kyle had instigated. The following details are extracts from the 2 letters sent home by a pilot officer, A.D. Garrison, later Air Commodore, who joined the squadron in December 1937, direct from the cadet course at Point Cook. And the pilot officer wrote, "Dear Mother, I feel certain that our flight has confounded the critics of Demon aircraft. Apart from a squadron of 9 Wapitis in 1929, this formation of 7 is the largest number of aircraft ever to cross Australia together. We never even had so much as a puncture or a scratch of paint on the whole trip. We left Laverton at 1 o'clock and ran into some heavy weather on our way to Nil, but just as we reached the mountains, we ran out of it. A few minutes later, we landed at Nil, refuelled and set off to Adelaide. The Anson, of course, flew straight on to Adelaide without stopping at Nil. After the planes were refuelled and away in the hangars, we all went into Adelaide and stayed at the Hotel Richmond. We had dinner and sat and yarned till about 9, then off to bed. We were called at 5:30 a.m, then after breakfast out to the aerodrome about 14 miles away. We set off at 8 o'clock and had 2 stretches of over 40 miles each to do over the water. Although we were at over 8,000 feet, plenty of height to glide to the shore in the event of an engine failure, I was jolly glad to be over land again. We made such good time that we did not have to land at Cayenne Cutter, but went straight on to Sqdn. We had a bite to eat at the A&A Rest House and hopped off straight across the desert to Cook. When we were over Cook, we had sufficient fuel to take us onto Forest, but the flight commander, W. Kyle, could not take the risk, so we landed there and just filled one of our tanks. We arrived at Forest about 4 p.m, and the heat was simply terrific. We had to hand pump the petrol, and although it was done in the shade of the hangar, it was hot work. Whichever way you looked, it was perfectly flat, and saltbush scattered everywhere, never more than 2 feet high. But we spent the night there. I was quite surprised at the excellent accommodation and the food. rising at 4:15 a.m. on Thursday, had the excellent accommodation and breakfast, and sat down to wait for the first glimmer of light, and took off for Rawlinna, then on to Kalgoorlie, where practically the whole town turned out to welcome us. Next morning after takeoff, we dived in salute over the town and on to Tamman, only 87 miles from Perth. We had a rest, took on a little fuel as we had to do formation flight over Perth. We were due over Perth at 2 p.m, and exactly at 2 p.m. we passed dead over the city in perfect formation after 2,000 miles crossing Australia. We flew around the suburbs and the city for half an hour, and then dived in formation and salute over Pearce, broke formation and landed after one of the most successful flights ever made by the RAAF. As we stepped from our machines, Wing Commander Brownell congratulated us individually in only the manner he can. That was the letter that Pilot Officer Garrison wrote to his mother 3 days after his flight arrived here on the 10th of March 38. His other comments were, the success of our epic crossing of the continent was undoubtedly due to our A Flight Commander, Flight Lieutenant Kyle, whose professional approach to his duties and his already very highly developed qualities of leadership. That number 23 Squadron arrival in Perth was by the transcontinental train. A ground party led by Flying Officer Hannah was welcomed at the Perth railway station by Sir George Pearce and the Lord Mayor, Mr Harper. During a march through the city of Perth by the squadron personnel, Flight Lieutenant Kyle timed the arrival over Perth of the air party of the Hawker Demons and the Anson aircraft. On Saturday, 28th of May, which was Empire Day, 1938, the station's first open day was held and 7,000 members of the public are reported to have attended. Equipped with 6 Avro Anson aircraft, 6 Hawker Demon aircraft and 3 Avro Cadet trainers, Number 23 Squadron commenced operations with Army cooperation tasks and conducted flying training and meteorological observation flights. Training activities included from October 38, providing initial pilot training for citizen Air Force cadet officers. The first 6 successful cadets were C.V. Anderson, R.A. Little, M.T. Lockwood, G.J. Manford, L.W. Manning and E.T. Weston, all of whom graduated as pilots in September 1939, and were then accepted into the Permanent Air Force to serve with Number 25 Squadron. These 6 members were subsequently proved to be the only pilots trained by 25 Squadron during that period. As with the advent of World War II, the need for pilots necessitated the establishment of a dedicated flying training unit to meet the wartime demand. Consequently, the squadron continued with its other assigned original role as an operational general purpose and later heavy bomber flying unit. On the 1st of January 1939, Number 23 Squadron was renamed Number 25 General Purpose Squadron, though no explanation for the name change is recorded in the squadron's records. Subsequently, a new unit, Number 23 Squadron, was formed at RAAF Station Richmond, New South Wales on the 6th of February 1939 and is currently located at RAAF Base Amberley in Queensland. On the 6th of February 1939, personnel and aircraft were transferred from 25 Squadron to form Station Headquarters Pearce and to form Number 14 Squadron. Number 25 Squadron, with Flight Lieutenant Brian Blackjack Walker as commanding officer, operated from the newly completed Hangar 93, while Number 14 Squadron operated from Hangar 95. With the outbreak of World War II, Number 25 Squadron was brought up to full operational status and was initially engaged on convoy protection work and anti-submarine patrols in the Fremantle and Rottnest Island area, operating Demon and Anson aircraft, and after January 40, Wirraway aircraft. Meanwhile, elements of Number 14 Squadron, still operating the Anson aircraft, were deployed to patrol between Broome and Wyndham to watch for enemy raiders. Early in 1940, Number 14 Squadron was returned to Pearce, and both 14 and 25 Squadrons were tasked to provide protection to convoys transporting the 2nd Australian Imperial Force to the Middle East, as these convoys were deemed more strategic than the possible enemy use of remote parts of Western Australia. This left the whole of Western Australia to the north of Geraldton undefended, at least from the air dimension. Number 14 Squadron was equipped with Hudsons from 14 April onwards. By June 1941, Number 25 Squadron was equipped with 18 Wirraway and 3 Mothminer aircraft and was operating as 3 flights. A flight undertaking Army cooperation tasks with Flying Officer Pace as the temporary officer commanding. The B flight was undertaking bomber tasks under the command of Flying Officer MacDonald, and C flight undertaking fighter tasks under Flying Officer Spence. Later, as a wing commander, Lou Spence commanded No. 77 Squadron and was killed in action on 9 September 1950 during the Korean War. And you might like to know that in our audience today, one of those members of Sea Flight is John Bailey. Both numbers 14 and 25 squadrons took part in searches for the survivors from the HMAS Sydney, which was sunk off the coast in November 41, which was the most significant action off Western Australia during the war. Operating from Carnarvon, Western Australia, 5 Wirraway aircraft from 25 Squadron flew a total of 111 hours during a coastal and island search from 24 November to 1 December 1941. When the Greater Pacific War commenced and the subsequent threat of an invasion of Australia mainland became a possibility, No. 25 Squadron's importance to the defence of South West Australia became apparent. Bruce the Buffalo fighters, originally intended for the Royal Netherlands East Indies, were added to the squadron's order of battle in 1942, and the squadron increased army cooperation training in preparation for the Japanese landing, which fortunately never came. Early in 1942, No. 77 Squadron was formed for the air defence of South West Australia, operating the newly acquired Kitty Hawk P-40E aircraft, but that squadron was soon moved to Batchelor in Northern Territory, where its capability could be better used for Australia's national defence. However, before No. 77 Squadron was moved, the difficult to maintain Brewster Buffaloes had to be armed first before they could take over the air defence role. The armaments were fitted by No. 4 Aircraft Depot, then located at Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. On the 17th of March 1942, the duty officer informed Group Captain Paddy Hefferman that a number of aircraft wooden cases had arrived at the Bullsbrook railway siding from the port of Fremantle. It was assumed that these boxes contained Kitty Hawk fighters to re-equip 77 Squadron, and No. 25 Squadron was equally excited. The appearance of a Pegasus radial engine followed by a bulky cockpit fuselage of an archaic Swordfish biplane caused some deflation of enthusiasm. Hefferman decided to have the aircraft assembled by Sergeant Wright, who had experience on Wapiti aircraft, and threatened to remuster him if he was unsuccessful, although no handbooks accompanied the crates. Group Captain Hefferman flew the first assembled aircraft, followed by eager pilots. Records show that numbers 14 and 25 squadrons operated 6 Swordfish, with the respective serial numbers being Victor 4683, Victor 4688, Victor 4689, Victor 4692, Victor 4693, and Victor 4694. Number 25 Squadron operated 3 aircraft on anti-submarine patrols off Rottnest Island and the gauge roads off the port of Fremantle. All pilots converted to the Swordfish, but it appears that Sergeant Coulter amassed the greatest number of hours, while another Sergeant, Dudley Irwin, navigator, later became Minister of Air in the John Gordon government in 1969. Number 14 Squadron was allocated Swordfish for communications work with regular flying between Pearce and Squadron detachments at Busselton, Cunderdin and Carnarvon. Station headquarters also appears to have used the Swordfish, as evidenced by a flight to Cunderdin on 27th of March 42, flown by Group Captain Hefferman, Flight Lieutenant Kirkman and Flying Officer Kimpton. It appears that on at least one occasion, more than one person occupied the rear cockpit. All pilots who flew the Swordfish found it a most interesting aircraft and gained an appreciation of the Royal Navy pilots who flew it in combat. Paddy Hefferman later recalled that they all had a lot of fun with their private air force before the RAAF headquarters in Melbourne gave the orders to have the aircraft disassembled, recrated and forwarded to their rightful owners. Research as to their final destination has revealed no details, but it is assumed they arrived at the Royal Navy base in Ceylon. This aspect of 25 Squadron's history is little known to the outside world. In February 1943, number 85 Squadron, formed from 25 Squadron's Sea Fighter flight, was raised to provide air defence for southwest Western Australia by flying Brewster Buffalo aircraft, as by this time the spare parts resupply and aircraft maintenance regime necessary to successfully operate these aircraft had been established. On 2 May 43, the Australian design and built Boomerang replaced the Buffaloes. At the same time, number 14 Squadron transitioned from Hudson's to the Bristol Beaufort aircraft, which substantially increased the unit's reconnaissance and maritime combat capability. In August 43, number 25 Squadron was re-equipped with the Vengeance dive bombers, which increased the squadron's capability, in particular for maritime interdiction role. During this time, the squadron suffered the loss of Vengeance 827-295, 50 miles south of Southern Cross and 55 miles east of Narrabeen. That's 32 south and 11920 east, creating a wartime mystery. Pilot Warrant Officer Jack Ingram survived, but navigator Flight Sergeant Clyde King was never found, despite one of the largest searches in Australia's history. Charles Page's book Vengeance of the Outback can give you a full account of this tragedy, and you can talk to Charles about that after the presentation. By late 1944, the threat of invasion had diminished and number 25 Squadron's role was changed to that of a heavy bomber squadron, and its members began conversion to the B-24 Liberator aircraft at 7 Operational Training Unit located at Tocumwal, New South Wales. This left number 85 Squadron newly equipped with Spitfire aircraft for the air defence and number 14 Squadron for the maritime defence of southwest Australia. Also by this time, substantial air units had been deployed to northwest Australia. However, the Pearce of 1944 was not the Pearce of today, and the runways of that time and tarmac space available was unsuited to sustained Liberator operations, so the squadron moved to Cunardon. That's an example of how Pearce started in 1938. Some more buildings in 39. Flight Lieutenant Kyle is in the group of pilots that brought those demons across from Laverton. Demons and Ansons in the hangar.
So is that the governor that ended up Wallace Kyle?
Yeah,
Yes.
from Kalgoorlie.
We'll come to that to the end of the presentation. And you saw from the very brief diagram that Mel had presented, that's how Pearce Aerodrome looked like at the end of 1944, and at the time that we lost the Vengeance. The Liberator operations started on the 11th of January 1945 from Cunardon with its full complement of 12 Liberator aircraft, a mixture of B-24 Lima and B-24 Mike variants. Initially, the squadron undertook maritime search and rescue missions off the west coast. In March 45, the squadron, on deployment to bases in northwest Australia, commenced bombing raids against enemy targets in the Netherlands, East Indies, in a series of operations that lasted until the end of World War II. On 11 March 1945, 6 crews mounted number 25 Squadron's first bombing mission, codenamed Operation Cunardon 3. The aircraft flew from Operational Base Unit 58 at Truscott Airfield on the Anjo Peninsula on the northern tip of Western Australia against a barge staging point at Atapopi in Timor. The mission was aborted over Atapopi with thick cloud prevented visual acquisition of the targets, and all aircraft returned safely. Bombing operations continued with extremely hazardous but successful attacks being mounted against enemy landing barges at Mapin, Timor and aerodromes in Java. On 13 March, a strike was also made against a barge staging point at Mapin on Sumba Island, and on 28th of March, shipping was attacked in the Alice and Lombok Straits, with 1 vessel being sunk and 2 others damaged. In the period of 16 to 20 April 1945, combined attacks with B-24 aircraft flown by 21 Squadron were made on Java and other targets in the Netherlands and East Indies. On 26 April, attacks were made on the Malong airfield near Surabaya. During this operation, 1 aircraft was forced down near Sumba Island and the entire crew was captured by enemy troops. Despite being brutally treated, all survived and were repatriated at the end of the war. This aircraft, A-72-133, was one of the 2 aircraft lost in operations, the other being on 14 February 1945, when aircraft A-72-134 crashed on takeoff at Cunardon with a loss of 5 crew members. The squadron also lost 2 aircraft to ground handling accidents, one, A-72-134 at Cunardon on 6th of March 45, and the other A-72-137 at RAAF Base Darwin, Northern Territory on 27 November 45, but there were no fatalities during either accident. Wing Commander J.B. Hampshire, the last wartime CO, began his tour of duty on 11 May 45. 25 Squadron carried out bombing operations against targets throughout North Timor, Bali, Lombok Straits, Java and Brunei Bay. The squadron flew its last bombing mission on 5 August 1945, the day before the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The target was fuel tanks and port installations in Banjarwangi Harbour, Java. 4 crews took part in that mission, codenamed Operation Sqdn.Ldr.Paul 22. Very imaginative, these names. Launching from Operational Base Unit 73 at Corunna Downs, which is near Marble Bar. On the way to the target, the first aircraft aborted as a result of leaking fuel and returned safely to Corunna Downs. The second aircraft hit the target with a string of 9 500-pound bombs. The third aircraft missed the target with its string of bombs, while the fourth aircraft hit the target with its load of 30 incendiary clusters. The intelligence assessment was that the mission was successful in that much damage was caused to the eastern peninsula of the harbour installation. The 3 aircraft that made the target also return safely, and this may have been the last bombing mission flown by the RAAF during the Second World War. At the close of the war, No. 25 Squadron had a complement of 718 members, which comprised 121 commissioned officers and 597 other ranks, and operated 14 Liberator bombers and 1 Tiger Moth aircraft. For its service throughout the Second World War, No. 25 Squadron was awarded the Battle Honour Eastern Waters 1941 to 1945. Some 85 missions against enemy targets resulted in a signal of congratulations from General MacArthur, Supreme Commander, Allied Forces South Pacific, for the support the squadron had done in the Allied landings at Brunei Bay. The battle honour you can see on the left-hand side of the squadron standard. From September 45 to January 46, the squadron operated from Sqdn but remained on deployment in northwest Australia and Cocos Islands, and was involved in resupply in Java and the repatriation of Australian ex-POWs and internees from Borneo and Morotai. On 25 October 45, Wing Commander Hampshire was awarded the D of Distinguished Flying Cross. On 30 March 46, the unit was reduced to number-only status before being disbanded on 9 July 46 at Sqdn. Both numbers 14 and 85 squadrons had previously been disbanded at Pearce in late 1945. Now we come to the notable members of the squadron. Some notable former members of 25 Squadron included Flight Lieut.Wallace Kyle. Sir Wallace Kyle was born in Kalgoorlie, the goldfields of Western Australia, in 1910, and completed his education at Guildford Grammar in Perth. At age 17, he presented himself to the Government House in Perth to be interviewed by Sir William Campion for selection for one of the few scholarships to Cranwell Royal Air Force College. He was successful and arrived in Cranwell in January 1928, where he excelled in a wide variety of sports. After being awarded his wings, he became an instructor at Cranwell, and years later was appointed Deputy Commandant. He served for a time in the Fleet Air Arm, which was then part of the RAF. As CEO of No. 139 Squadron in World War II, he was a fearless and inspired leader. As a staff officer, he held many important positions. In the post-war period, as Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, he was responsible for the V Bomber Force and then later the Strike Command up until his retirement. In the Royal Air Force, he was affectionately known as Digger. He rose to the rank of Air Marshal in the Royal Air Force, served as Vice Chief of the RAF from 62 to 65, and later became Governor of Western Australia from 75 to 80. Pilot Officer Colin Hannah became the RAAF's Chief of Air Staff from January 1970 to March 72, and was knighted and then appointed Governor of Queensland from March 72 to March 1977. That concludes the presentation on 25 Squadron's World War II history.